In order to make this dress, you are going to need the following items as well as your pattern. You'll need your main fabric, so do check the size guide to determine exactly how much you need. Your lining fabric, which can also be the same as your main fabric. It depends on what your fabric looks like. For this particular dress, I've chosen to have a white lining to the bodice, simply because the pattern of this particular fabric has a lot of white on it or cream on it, and if I line my dress with this fabric, the pattern will show through on the bodice, which I just don't want to happen. So I've chosen a plain lining fabric. And then an invisible zip. These are the zips that have a concealed zip or an invisible zip. You can see the top of it there. It's exactly what it looks like. You'll also need a hook and eye. Just need one of these. And obviously some thread. Now we've got this organic thread we're going to be using today in our sew along. It's organic cotton, so that will match really nicely, and it's a lovely cream that will go really nicely with our dress. Okay, so let's get started. In step 1, we are going to sew the darts on pattern piece A, which is our back bodice piece, and you will see that I have actually already marked on using a washable pen where these darts are. So our next task is to pin those darts and sew them in place. With right sides together, I'm going to fold along that centre of the dart line, and I'm going to pop a pin exactly along the line that I just marked with my pen, and I'm going to check on the back that it aligns, where the pin is, aligns on the other side too. If it doesn't, I'm just going to shift that dart around a little bit so that I get that really nice, neat, precise finish. And repeat for the other dart. So, as you can see, I've pinned along the line of where the dart is, and now I'm going to sew the dart starting at the bottom, the widest bit. I'm going to sew it right along to the top and sew off the fabric at the end, nice and carefully, so we get a lovely sharp point to that dart. I'm going to start sewing at the bottom with a 2.5mm stitch length, and then I'm going to gradually decrease the stitch length as I get up to the top of the point. We've sewn the 2 darts, and because I sewed off at the top of the dart to get a nice neat finish, I'm now just going to secure the ends of the thread by knotting it 2 or 3 times. We're now going to press these darts that we've sewn towards the side seams. You may find it helpful to use a tailor's ham to do this. We'll then repeat the same process for the lining pieces, creating those darts in the same manner. Step 2. With right sides together, pin the bodice front F to the bodice back A at the shoulder seams. As we line up our shoulder seams, we're making sure that the V is crossed over at the front in the middle, and that our arms are matching up there and there. Our standard seam allowances are 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch. So I'm now going to sew this seam at 1.5 centimetres away from the raw edge on both shoulders. I'm then going to press this seam open, like that. We're now going to repeat the exact same process with the lining pieces. Now, if your lining pieces are the same on both sides like mine, you might find it easier to put a little note on one of your pieces using a washable ink pen. On this one I've just said right side, so I know which is the right side and which is the wrong side. So that's my right side there, going down, face down, right sides together, like that, and we'll just give it a pin. The bodice lining has also now been sewn together at the shoulders and the seam pressed open. Step 3 asks us to stay stitch the neckline all the way around from one side to the other. We're going to stay stitch, which is a 5mm stitch length, and we're going to stay stitch it within the seam allowance. So rather than 1.5mm, we're going to just do 10mm offset from the raw edge and stay stitch 10mm all the way around. A stay stitch is a stitch that helps to prevent the fabric pieces from moving and shifting and just distorting. So because this neckline has a lot of sewing that's about to happen on it, lots of frills and gathers and loads of different fabrics going to be sewn to it, we just want to make sure that the shape of this bodice isn't compromised in any way. So we'll do that now. We're then going to repeat that for the lining. These next steps are for adding the ruffles, which are optional steps if you have chosen to sew your dress with ruffles along the sleeves and the neckline. These steps are for you, so steps 4A to 7 are optional steps. If you're not doing ruffles, just move straight on to step 8A. With pattern piece D, which is the neckline ruffle, you should have 2 of those, and we're going to do right sides together. We're going to pin along the longer edge, which is up here, and we're just going to sew using our standard seam allowance just down here. Once you've sewn that seam, then press open the seam allowance. Now, with wrong sides together, we're now going to fold this piece lengthwise like this and iron it in place. This is wrong sides together. We're now going to prepare the gathers of piece D, which is our neck piece. We've folded it, wrong sides together, and we have the raw edge on one side and the folded edge on the other side. What we need to do is to prepare the gathers along the raw edge all the way down, and I'm going to start sewing up at one end, and I'm going to sew all the way down using a gathering stitch, which is a long stitch, all the way down to the middle where you can see where the seam allowance is here. I'm going to back stitch at this point, just 3 or 4 stitches, and then I'm going to continue sewing all the way down to the other end of the fabric and leave a trail of thread at that end and a trail of thread at the other end as well. What this means is that when I attach the gathers, when I attach the piece to the bodice, it means that I can use this as a secure point and ensure that I'm going to get even gathers on either side of the full length of the piece. Using a long stitch length of 5mm, I'm going to sew within the seam allowance one line at 5mm, offset from the raw edge. I'm going to go backwards and forwards when I hit the seam line at the centre of the piece and continue on. When I get to the end, I'm going to let it out and make sure I leave a long excess of thread so I can use that to gather later. I've done one line offset at 5mm from the raw edge, which is here. I'm then going to do another line with about 1 centimetre offset from the raw edge with the same long stitch length. Back and forth in the middle again when you hit the seam. As you can see, we've now got 2 lines of gathering stitches. These are nice long lines, and right in the middle, at the centre seam, you can see I've gone backwards and forwards a few times just to secure the gathering stitches at the middle. We're now going to attach this piece, D, which is our neck gather, to our bodice front. Now we're going to attach it with right sides together. Obviously both sides of pattern piece D are right sides, so it doesn't matter which side you pick. I'm going to get the seam allowance at the middle of pattern piece D and line it up with the centre of the back. I'm going to pop a pin in here, and this is where I back stitched. We've now got an equal amount of neckline to gather on one side and then on the other side. So starting at one side, get 2 threads from one side of your fabric, which are your gathering threads. I like to tie a little knot in them just so I know that that's the right one. And they stay together and pull evenly. We're then just very simply going to start to pull along that line, and we're going to distribute those gathers evenly along the whole of this piece D. This does require a little bit of patience, but it's totally worth it for the lovely, elegant look you're going to get at the end. You mustn't pull too aggressively with the threads, otherwise the gathering threads might actually snap and break. So just do be gentle as you do this. Once you've gathered a reasonable amount, you may just want to gauge how much more gathering you need to do, just by putting it in place like this along the line of the bodice and just checking. Gosh, that looks almost perfect. Just checking the exact length of it. That's looking pretty good for me, just maybe a little bit too much there. I'm now going to tie a knot so that those gathers do not come undone. And now I'm just going to look at these gathers and make sure they're even. You see there's a bit up here which isn't very even, and down here there's like loads of gathers. So I'm just going to move up some of these gathers along the line of stitches just to try and get an even distribution of the gathers. Okay, that looks pretty good. We're now going to pin this side, now that we've prepared all the gathers and it's ready, to the bodice. We're going to pin pattern piece D with raw edges matching. So raw edges together. If you need to, just redistribute the gathers as you do this. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's nice to try and get them as even as you can. Now, once you've pinned it in place all the way around half, I would then do exactly the same for the other half. This one is a little bit too short when I get it down to here. I've got a little bit, about an inch at the bottom here, so I'm just going to release some of the gathers at this end to make sure that the pattern piece D aligns with the same length as around the bodice neckline. When I'm pinning, I'm trying to get an even distribution of the gathers, but also an even distribution of the fabric to make sure. So I'm just pinning in between, pinning like the big bits together. I've pinned the bottom, I pinned it at the top, and I pinned it in the middle, and then I'm going to halve that again, the distance between those two pins. Pop a pin in there, just making sure that the fabric is sitting nice and flat underneath the gathers. Just constantly pinning and halving, pinning and halving. Okay, so we have now evenly distributed the gathers. We've now pinned pattern piece D to pattern pieces F and A all the way along. We've pinned it in place, and now we're just going to baste in place using a 10 mils seam allowance. The reason why we're just going to baste in place, which is I'm using a similar stitch to the gathering stitch, so it's going to be a long stitch, 5 mil stitch length, and we're going to sew it within the seam allowance at 1 centimetre offset from the raw edge. The reason why we're doing this is because we're then going to sew another line of stitches when we attach this to the lining using our standard seam allowance at that point. So for now, we're just going to baste this ruffle in place. We're now going to repeat the same process for the shoulder ruffles. So we've got 2 of these, so we'll do them one at a time. First of all, we're going to iron with wrong sides together, lengthways. I'm now going to do my gathering stitches from one side to the middle, go backwards and forwards at the middle where there's a notch, and then continue along to the end. We've now got 2 rows of gathering stitches on the fabric within the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. We're going to repeat the process for the second shoulder ruffle. Once again, with right sides together, we want to be attaching our sleeve ruffles to the sleeve on this side. Now you'll notice that you have got 2 notches, one here and also 2 on the back. What I'd like you to do is to align the edge of, well, that's the extent that the ruffle should continue on to, so from one notch down to the other notch. But you also have the notch that you had on this pattern piece, and that notch will sit really nicely on the shoulder seam. So we're going to align this notch with the shoulder seam at this point. That's why you went backwards and forwards. And we're going to do it with the ruffle pointing in and the raw edges aligning on this side. Okay, I'm just going to start the gathering process once more. Now obviously there's a lot less, this is a much smaller piece than the neckline, so a bit quicker to do. Just going to even out those gathers. And we're going to do the same for the other side. Once you've prepared and pinned this shoulder seam in place, we're just going to do exactly the same on the other side. Excellent. Once you've got those two shoulder ruffles pinned in place, you're now just going to baste them in place as we did with the neckline at a 1 centimetre offset from the raw edge. Okay, so we've now got our neck ruffle in place and our shoulder ruffle in place, and we're going to move on. Moving on to step 8A, with right sides together, pin centre panel G, lining and outer, and stitch together at the top. Right sides together, put these two pieces together like that, pin along the top, and sew a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. We're then going to use our iron to press the seam allowance up towards the lining. We've pressed the seam allowance up towards the lining. If we then turn it right sides up, we're now just going to understitch along this side of the seam, so on the lining side, and we're just going to do a small row of stitches, about 3 or 4 mil, 3 mil offset from the centre of that seam on this side of the fabric. We're going to be sewing through 3 layers of fabric, our lining seam and our main fabric. We're going to sew through all those 3 layers on this side. We're going to use a top stitch length, which is 1.6 mil. And as you can see, we've just done a really nice narrow line of stitching on this side, just to hold that seam allowance in place. To finish off this piece now, we're going to fold wrong sides together along the top up here. We're going to fold it so that there is, and iron it in place along that seam at the top. Now you will see that I've ironed it so that on the lining side of the fabric we've got a small edge of the main fabric showing through, so that when the dress is worn and you see the centre panel on this side, you can't see any of the lining, even if it just moves around a little bit, because that outer is just rolled over slightly so that it sits really nicely on the inside and the lining. Moving on to step 9, we're going to get our bodice top, which we've already added the ruffles on, and we're going to put our centre panel piece G with right sides together on top of our bodice panel along the front of the neckline at this point. Now, depending on which panel piece you chose, the low or the high one, there should be a corresponding notch on the inside of pattern piece F, which I can see right there, and that should line up perfectly with the top of your panel G. Now, if you're choosing to do the lower neckline, you'll want to take the first notch along that stretch. If you're doing the higher neckline, there'll be a second notch up here that you can line up your pattern piece with. For this demo, I'm doing the lower neckline. So I'm going to line that up with the notch at the top, and I'm just going to pin it in place. Now, it is important to line it up with the notch because you don't want to have a wonky neck line when you sewn it together on the other side. So that notch is a really important reference for you to use. Okay, we're now just going to sew that in place using our standard seam allowance. Okay, so we've sewn the centre panel onto this side of the front bodice. We now need to sew it onto that side as well. So we've sewn it together, I'm going to open it out, and you can see it's beginning to look like the dress there, isn't it, with the ruffles facing out that way. It's looking gorgeous. So with right sides together, flip the whole thing over and align that centre panel with the opposite side of front bodice piece F. Now let's remember to line this top bit up with the notch beautifully up here so we get a nice even straight top across our bodice. pin that in place and stitch using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way down. That's beginning to look more like the top, isn't it? Lovely. You now need pattern piece B, and we're going to be attaching that, which is the back bodice panel, onto pattern piece A with right sides together. Make sure that you sew this the correct way round, and make sure that the wider and longer curve is going to be attached onto the bottom of piece panel A. So like that, we're going to flip it up like that. You'll also notice that you've got notches on the back bodice panel, and these notches will align perfectly with the darts that you sewed previously into the back bodice. So pin along where those darts are first, because they're your reference, and continue to pin the rest of the length with right sides together. Now you'll notice that you're sewing a curve onto a straight line, so there is a bit of tension that's being created as a result of that, and that's absolutely fine, we're expecting that. Now I want you to sew all the way along this seam with your standard stitch length of 1.5 mil. After you've sewn the seam, press it down towards the waist, which is down here. Press both of them down towards the waist. Moving on to step 12, we're now going to prepare the gathers of the front bodice. We're going to use our notches as a guide to gather the extent of what we need to gather. We basically want to gather from here, which is just where the ruffle attaches onto pattern piece F, or where pattern piece F attaches to the centre panel if you're not doing the ruffles. And we're going to do some gathering stitches from that point all the way to this notch right here. We have a notch there, and we'll have another one on this side over here. So we're going to do our gathering stitches between there and there only. We're going to do 2 rows of stitches of our gathering stitches, which is our long length of stitch. The first one will be 5 mil offset from the raw edge, and the second line of stitching will be a centimetre offset from the raw edge. I'm going to prepare my gathering stitch on one side and on the other side. In step 13, we're going to be sewing the front bodice panel C to the front bodice, which is here. Now you'll notice that this is a lot shorter. The length of that top curve, which will be attached onto the seam, is a lot shorter than this curve here, and that's because we still need to gather these 2 sections in enough to fit the width of that. So with right sides together, I'm just going to line up these 2 notches here at the top of front panel piece C to the notches which are at the bottom of panel piece G. I'm actually just going to rotate that round so it's a bit easier for me to do. With right sides together, I'm going to put that piece over there, aligning up the 2 notches at the centre of panel piece G and the front bodice panel. I'm then going to put another pin right at the edge of where this seam comes down, where we started our gathering stitches, because there are no gathers along the centre panel piece G. It's just sewn flat and flush against each other. Putting another pin at the same point here, making sure that the ruffle is lying flat underneath. Okay, so we know that bit's flat. We also know that the panel piece over here is going to line up really nicely between the notch and the end, and that's not gathered, so we can ease that across. You'll also notice that there is a notch here which aligns up with the notch on the bodice panel piece F. So we'll pin this in place. And the same on the corresponding side. Okay, so we've pinned these 2 bits on the outer side of the bodice piece, and they're flat, and also we've pinned the centre bit here. This bit in between is a bit we're going to gather. In order to do this, I'm just going to flip the piece over, and you can see that we've got a lot of excess on either side, haven't we? So we're going to gather that in now and evenly distribute the gathers so that they perfectly match the bodice panel piece underneath. Now, depending on the bust cup size that you chose, you'll have more or less gathers at this point, but do try and get them even so they just look really comfortable and elegant as you put them on. Distribute your gathers evenly and then pin in place. And repeat the exact same process on the other side with gathering your stitches to ensure that piece is the same length as the bodice panel. Okay, we're now just going to stitch in place using our standard seam allowance all the way along. As we did to the back, we're now just going to press this seam allowance down towards the waistline, which is here. We're now going to repeat a very similar process with our bodice lining fabric. So with right sides together, we're going to pin the back bodice panel B to the back bodice, which is A, which is here. Now, exactly the same as the previous time, we're just going to make sure that we've got the pieces the right way up with the curve, the bigger curve, aligning with the straight line of the back here. You'll also notice there's a notch there and a notch there, which is going to align with our two darts at this point. So roll it over and right sides together, align up the notch with the darts. We're going to sew that using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. And then we're going to press that seam down towards the waistband like that. Step 15. At the base of the neckline only, fold the raw edge of the front bodice lining under by 15 mil, 1.5 centimetres, with the wrong sides together. So we're going to fold that bit over just by 15 mil at this point, iron that in place, and the same on the other side. Once we've ironed just these bottom bits, we then need to prepare the gathers along the bottom stretch of the front bodice, piece F. We're going to prepare the gathers and do our gathering stitches between the point and the centre of the bodice at this point, and we're going to sew all the way along to the notch. The first line of stitching will be 5 mil offset from the raw edge, and the second line of stitching will be 1 centimetre offset from the raw edge. Remember, with your gathering stitches, these are long stitches of a 5 mil stitch length. I'm going to go backwards and forwards at the beginning and then leave a long thread at the end where the notch is so that I can pull that gather together. And repeat for the opposite side. Step 16 is where we're going to attach the front bodice F to the front bodice panel C of the lining. Now we will have a gap here where the centre, to allow space for the centre panel of the outer fabric, and at this point we have folded over with wrong sides together just a little bit and ironed this along here. We've also prepared the gathers and we've got some long strings of thread at either end of those pieces. Now we need to attach this to here, but you'll notice that this long curved edge is actually shorter than the curved edges of these pieces. Now the reason for that is that we're actually going to gather these pieces in so that it will fit beautifully. This is where you really need to have marked your notches on your front bodice panel piece C. You should have 4 notches here, you should have 1 here and a corresponding one over here, and again you should have 2 in the middle here and here. So those are the notches that you need. First of all, with right sides together, turn that over and just pin between the edge of the fabric and the first notch. Now this bit is a section which is not going to be gathered, so it can just be pinned nice and flat. We know that from here to here, that's where our gathering stitches are. We are going to be gathering, so we don't want to pin that quite yet. But what we do want to do is to align the edge of this piece right here with the second notch, which is along here. So you're going to have to pull that fabric over, align it up with this notch here, and just pin that in place. Now the next reference point is your third notch along, and this notch is going to align with the edge of the fabric here. So just line that up and put one pin in at this point here as a reference. And then finally, ease the fabric over, align this edge and your final fourth notch at this point here, and pin in place. As you can see, we will have a gap here for the centre panel, and that's absolutely fine, that's what we're expecting. Flip the fabric over, and for this I'm just going to rotate it round. And now we're just going to gather the excess fabric here. So you can see we've got quite a lot of excess fabric here. We're just going to gather that now by pulling on the strings of our gathering stitches. Now, depending on which cup size you've chosen or you need for your pattern, you'll have more or less to gather at this point. Make sure that your gathers are evenly distributed along the length of that area, and then pin in place. Repeat for the other side. Don't forget to tie a knot once you've gathered the length that you need, just to stop those gathers from unravelling once you start to pin it and sew it. Once you've pinned it in place, you can then just do a long line of stitching, stitch it in place at a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way along. Trim off any excess threads that you have from all of your gathering stitches, and then press this seam allowance down, including this bit here. We're now going to attach the lining to the bodice top. So to start off with, lay your lining like this with the right side facing up. And then with your main fabric, the right side facing down so that your right sides are together, lay that on top of the lining. What we're trying to do in this step is to attach the lining to the neckband. Obviously we have the centre panel in place, so first of all, we're just going to pin around here and all the way down to this point here. To start off with, match up the shoulder seams and pin those in place first. When you've done that, go to the other side, making sure that if you've got the ruffle, that it is pressed under, and is sitting flat. I'm actually putting 2 pins into the shoulder seams so that the seams are definitely sitting flat on both sides. Continue pinning the lining to the main fabric all the way around the neck. Okay, so I've pinned from around where the notch is on this side, where the top of my panel G is. I've pinned from there all the way around to that shoulder seam. I'm now just going to pin on this side. Now the reason for having the lining on this pattern and the way that it's done in this manner is so that the ruffles actually sit really nice and flat as you wear them. What we found if we didn't line it was that the ruffles just didn't sit as nicely or sit quite as cleanly. So this is a really important step to ensure that the ruffles just sit really nicely. Give you that really lovely sort of tailored finish. Okay, now that is step 17 completed. We've pinned all the way around from the top shoulder seams all the way down to here. Now at this point, I want you to pull the lining through, all the way through. Okay. And we're going to just continue pinning that raw edge all the way down as far as we can. Now, because you've sewn the centre panels together with the centre bodice panels on the lining and the outer, is quite a tight, it's going to be quite tight at this point, but that's okay. Pin down as far as you can. Okay, and then the same on the other side. So we've pulled through the lining. I'm just finding where the raw edge is and continuing that raw edge. I'm going to continue to pin it to the raw edge of the centre panel and the centre front bodice F, where we've already sewn them together, basted them in place, haven't we? As you can see, we've pinned all the way around the neckline from the bottom of piece F to the lining of piece F, with right sides together all the way round down to there. We're now going to stitch that in place using our standard seam allowance. As you're sewing this, just make sure, keep checking that you're not getting the lining caught up and sewn into the seam by accident, like the excess bits of the lining. Okay, so we've now sewn the lining to the main fabric, and we're now going to grade the seam allowance and clip around the curves. The reason why we grade the seam allowance is so that there isn't a big bulk sitting underneath your lining of your fabric. Can you see there's a bit of a bulk there? And what I really want us to do is just to grade it. So how we're going to do that is we're going to leave the main seam allowance flat. We're not going to change the length of that at all, but we are going to cut and trim back the ruffle seam allowance, and also then we're going to trim back even further the lining seam allowance. So we've got two that we need to just grade back. I'm going to start off by just grading and trimming the width of pattern piece D. This just removes the bulk out of the seam. Once you've graded the seam allowance, you can then clip the corners and the curves of the neckline. Now the reason we do this is to just remove some of the tension from the curve so that it's going to sit nice and flat. It's really just around the curves at the top. So far we've had the right sides of the fabric together and we've just been dealing with the neckline. I will now want you to iron the seam towards the lining. So in order to do that, pull the lining so it's all kind of bunched up in the middle, in the centre of the neckline. Let's pull it all out. There's a lot of fabric here, isn't there? Okay. And again, you might find using a tailor's ham quite helpful, just to sit underneath that, just to hold the fabric in place exactly how you want it around that curve. Now, we want to press the seam towards the lining, but you want to make sure that your ruffles are not being pushed that way, that your ruffles are sitting facing towards you and facing onto the bodice panel like that. So it's just your seam allowance that you're ironing that way. It's a bit tricky down here, but don't worry about that. That will all neaten up as we go along in the sewing process. Again, just make sure that you've got that ruffle pointing the right way. The fabric will want to sit like that anyway. The ruffle will want to sit flat against the main fabric. Once you've ironed it in place, we're then going to want to understitch this seam to the lining. So if I flip it over now, I want to do a stitch on the lining, 3mm from the seam, and I'm going to be stitching the seam allowance on the underside to the lining. Okay, so we've got the right side of the lining facing us up and the right side of the main fabric facing us up. Ruffle is pointing towards the main fabric, and our seam, we're just going to be stitching a understitch stitch all the way along on the lining on this side of the seam, just to hold all of this in place. Now you don't have to get all the way down to the bottom because we've still got a bit of a hole there which we're going to sort out in a minute between the lining and the main fabric. So this is just really trying to secure the ruffle so that it sits and lies in the right place. Let's go. We now just need to secure this bit of the lining to the main fabric. And we're going to do that by folding this up back onto the lining and also folding the corresponding panel underneath. because it's this seam here that we're just wanting to reinforce and stitch together. Okay, so we are just going to sew between these two pins here and here, which is just along the centre panel, and that's just so that we secure this bit in place. Now at this point you may just want to tidy up these bits here. There may just be a little bit of a hole between the lining of pattern piece G and the main fabric here, and the same on the other side, depending on how far you are able to sew down into this seam when we sewed this bit here. If you have got a bit of a hole and you'd like to tidy that area up, or even the area underneath, just get a needle and thread and just do a little bit of hand sewing. Just doing a really simple slip stitch just to hold it in place. So we're getting our needle and popping it right, catching a little bit on the underside, okay, and then pulling it through the lining on the top, so that you end up with a stitch that you can barely see. It's just sort of rolling round and under. Okay, so it's looking much nicer. Can you see that? Okay, just the same on the other side if you found that you needed it. Basically, what we're going to try and do in the next step is to sew the lining to the main fabric just along the shoulder seam here. So right now you've got the right lining with right side facing up, because that's how it's going to look when you sew it, when you wear it. And then we've got the wrong sides together of the lining and the main fabric at this point. However, everything else is loose right now, isn't it? It's just the neckline that's sewn together. So here we go. This method is called the burrito method. It's one of my favourite methods. It's a method that I really like to sew with. I think it's really smart and really clever, but it's a little bit tricky to explain, which is one of the reasons why I've done this video. So roll the fabric with the right sides facing up of your main fabric, roll it along like you'd roll up a burrito until you get to this side here. Now that's all beautifully rolled up, and at this point we want to pull the lining under and over so that the whole of this roll is sandwiched and so that these two seams are caught together. So if I get my thumb and put it in between the lining and the main fabric of the shoulder here, I'm going to hold the lining, the burrito bit, the bit I've rolled together, and then I'm going to lift the lining up. I'm still holding it here, and then I'm going to continue until it's over and right sides are now together on this seam. Very clever, isn't it? So now match up your shoulder seams, you should be able to see them there, and pin the shoulder seam in place. Next, you should be able to see where your notches are under your arms on the front and the back, and then pin the remaining seam. And we're just going to sew using a standard seam allowance all the way around, just from here, all the way around the curve of the armhole to there, 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way around. Okay, so we've just sewn all the way around here. That's as far as we've got. We're now going to grade the seam allowance and clip the curves. So we're going to leave the main fabric seam allowance complete and full. We're going to trim down the lining seam allowance. And then we're going to trim down your shoulder ruffle if you've got one. That's the gathered bit. That's also the most bulky bit. Once you grade it, just around the curves, give it a little clip. At this point, I'm going to reach in between the lining and the main fabric. I'm going to grab hold of that roll, that burrito roll we did, and I'm just going to pull it through. Keep pulling it until all the lining is on the right side. Now, can you see how beautiful that is What a lovely, detailed, gorgeous finish that provides. So now we've got our beautiful armhole seam fully lined, neckline seam fully lined, and it just looks really nice on both sides. We're now going to repeat the same step for the other shoulder seam. So we're going to roll it up, quite nice and tight if we can. We're going to get our thumbs between the lining and the main fabric here, hold down the roll, reach under and pull that lining up and over. Now the right side of your lining should be matching up with the right side of your main fabric. Match up the shoulder seams first. Match up the notches and continue pinning around the rest of the arm. I always sew this with the main fabric pointing up, simply so I can check that it's not going to get any puckers or gathers as I sew it on the main bit of the fabric, because that's the bit that I'm going to see. Obviously you want it all to sit nicely, but this is the most important bit. I'm going to grade the seam again, starting with the lining and trimming that back about 2/3 of the width of the seam allowance. And then trim through the ruffle. So that's about 1/3 trimmed off. Okay, and then pull your arm through, grab hold of the burrito roll and pull it all through. To finish off these shoulder seams, we're now just going to press the lining and the outer fabric so that it's going to sit really nicely. When you're ironing it, you just want to make sure that the outer fabric is slightly rolled under so that the lining fabric is not going to show on the front side as you wear it. Okay, moving on to step 25. I'm going to lay the bodice piece out exactly like this, pop it on the table in front of you like I've done here. And then with the right side of the lining, we want the lining, which is underneath, we want the right side sitting flat on the table. So the fabric's all going to bunch up a little bit. And the same on the other side. So the lining, I'm just going to flip it up a little bit so that the right side of the lining is here. Obviously you've sewn your armholes together at this point already, so you can lay that out flat. And you've got that flat. Now what we want to do is flip the front of the bodice over onto the back so that the right side of the front bodice is aligned with the right side of the back bodice, and the corresponding right side of the front lining is lined up with the right side of the back lining. So to do that, we're just going to fold it along the shoulder seam effectively. I'm going to grab these two and I'm just going to carefully flip it over like that. Now, I'm now going to pin all the way along this seam. I'm actually going to start off with the underarm seam here. I'm going to pin that in place, being really careful just to line up the seams so that they look as neat as possible. Next, I'm going to line up the back panel of the lining with the front panel lining. And we're going to pop a pin down at the bottom. If you feel like you need to pin it in between then those pins we've just done, feel free. If you've got more slippy fabric, you'll definitely need to do that. We're going to do the same with the main fabric as well, the outer fabric. So just really carefully align up those seams. Excellent. We're now going to sew that in place with our standard seam allowance. Okay, so we're going to turn that right sides out. And this is the side seam that we've just sewn up. So we've got one loose on that side, and it is the right hand side that we've just sewn. Now you can see that that's looking really nice now. So it's all matching up beautifully, at the seams here because we pinned them really carefully, and then we get up to the arm and it's all just beautifully tucked under there. And on the other side, obviously the lining is now also done in exactly the same way. So it looks really good. So I want you to press that seam now, and we'll move on to the next step. We're now going to attach the skirt and prepare the skirt to attach it to the bodice top. So with right sides together, you want to sew the two top skirt pieces H together, and you want to sew them along the right hand side as you wear it. Have a look at the image on the instructions and you'll see that right sides together, you're wanting to sew down this side if this is your top up here and your bottom is down here. So that's the way we're going to be pinning it on this side. It's just worth noting if you've got a print that is directional, so with me I've got these little birds like pointing up, make sure that both sides of the skirt are pointing up in the right direction and will hang in the same way. And also make sure that that the top is obviously the top if you've got a directional print, and the bottom is down here. So we're going to pop these right sides together and we're just going to pin along this side here, following the image on the instructions. And then we're going to sew this seam with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Now, because this bit of the skirt is actually going to be shown, we're not going to line it. The next part of the instructions say to finish the seam. So there's a number of different ways that you can finish the seam. You can use some pinking shears like these ones with the zigzag edge like this. You can use an overlocker, or you can just do a zigzag stitch all the way along the edge. Now, the reason why we do this is to prevent the fabric from fraying. You can see it's starting to fray if I pull it away, and that just makes this seam a little bit weaker. So we just want to secure this seam that we've sewn by finishing it appropriately. I will be using an overlocker, but obviously you can use either of the other two methods I've spoken about. Once we've done that, we're just going to press the seam open. We're now going to prepare the gathers of this skirt piece, and we're going to prepare the gathers at the top of the skirt piece, obviously because that's the bit we want to tie in with the waist. Just making sure again, if you've got a directional print, that you've definitely got the top that you're preparing the gathers with. When we prepare the gathers, we are going to sew from one side all the way to the seam. I'm then going to backstitch at that point, and then I'm going to continue sewing all the way to the other side of the skirt piece, and that way then I can there's less fabric to gather in my gathering stitch and when I attach it onto the skirt, because I can just attach this to one seam and that to the side seam, and then I can just gather the back and the front independently. We are going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches, which is our long stitch, 5mm stitch length, and we're going to do the first one 5mm from the top of the raw edge, and the second row of stitches 10mm from the top of the raw edge. We go backwards and forwards when we hit the seam, and then continue on. I've sewn one line, and I'm now just going to sew the second line of gathering stitches at 1 centimetre offset from the raw edge. Again, stopping at the side seam, going backwards and forwards, and then continuing on. Okay, we're now going to prepare the gathers of this big skirt piece. We've got 2 lines of gathering stitches, and I'm just going to grab the top 2 threads, which are these 2, leaving the bottom 2 free. I'm just going to tie a little knot to secure them together, and then I'm just going to start pulling the fabric so that it begins to gather really nicely. Okay, so we've started to prepare the gathers on there. It's ready for trying to match up with the top. I'm just going to do the same on the other side. You don't have to worry about getting the gathers too neat at this point, because we're going to actually align this on top of the bodice, which is what we're going to do now. Okay, so we have our skirt panel piece here, panel piece H, and we're just going to attach it to our bodice, which we've already sewn. We are going to carefully pull the lining away from the bodice as much as possible. And with the right sides together, first of all, I'm just going to pin the side seam of the bodice to the side seam of the skirt. I'm going to pin it and line it up nice and carefully. Just like that. Now that I've done that, I'm going to just check how much more I need to gather of the skirt, or how much less actually, in this case. I'm going to pull out the gathers just enough to make it so that the two pieces are the same length. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, and then I'm going to tie a little knot with these threads up here, just so that the width of this skirt piece does not move or change. I'm going to pull back the bodice top, and as you can see, these gathers are really inconsistent right now. I've got a big bunch here, got a big gap here, another bunch here. So I'm just going to ease these little gathers along the skirt so they are as even as possible. Now, by having done 2 rows of stitches for your gathering stitches, it means that you should be able to get a slightly more even finish to your gathers compared to, or even distribution, I should say, of your gathers compared to if you just done 1 row of gathering stitches. Again, you could do 3 or even 4 rows of gathering stitches if you want, and that would give you an even more even finish. But we've made this dress a few times and we think 2 is enough, depending on your fabric choice, obviously. Okay, that's looking much more even. Grab a few pins and start pinning it in place. I'm actually going to flip the dress over actually, so I can see, make sure my gathers are even. So I've got the gathers on the top now. I've pinned the sides. I'm then going to pin the middle. And then in between those 2 pins, pin the middle again. By doing it like this, it just means you get more even distribution of any ease that you need in the fabric as you're matching these 2 pieces together. I'm just going to repeat the same process with the back piece. So here I just need to gather it a little bit more, which is fine. We've pinned the bodice, making sure that the lining is kept away, and we've pinned the bodice main fabric to the skirt, panel pieces G. We're now going to sew all the way along there with our standard seam allowance. Now this seam that we've just sewn here, our gathered skirt to our bodice, is quite bulky because there's so many bits of fabric here, because there's so much gathering here. So what we've asked you to do is actually to grade this seam, which simply means we're going to get a pair of fabric scissors and we are just going to snip the skirt seam allowance in half, so it's half the width. So I've got my 2 seams here and here. I'm just going to snip the gathered one in half. This just helps reduce the bulk of this seam around your waist, which is obviously a nice thing to do, and helps the fabric just to sit nice and straight. Just make sure you're not catching the seam allowance of the bodice while you're doing this, that you're just trimming down the skirt piece. Once you've done that, just going to iron that seam up towards this centre bodice panel here. So we now have something that vaguely or very much resembles a dress, which is really exciting. At this point, we've now sewn the bodice to the skirt, which is great. So this is view A now, ready to go and to move on to inserting the zip. However, if you want to add additional tiers onto the skirt for the midi version, you now need to sew skirt pieces I together and attach them to the bottom of this skirt in the same way that we attached this skirt to the waistband. Gather it, sew it together, gather it and then distribute the gathers evenly around the bottom of this skirt. And then if you want the maxi version, you then need to repeat the same for pieces J. For the purpose of this video, we're just going to move straight on to inserting the zip. We're now going to move on to inserting the zip down the left side of the dress. You'll notice that you've got raw edges here of your main fabric and also of your lining as well. So in order to tidy that up a little bit, we're going to ask you just to overlock and finish these raw edges here using an overlocker, pinking shears or a zigzag stitch just to finish that whole seam off really nicely and neatly. And we will continue to finish the seam all the way down the entire length of the dress. So for me on this version, I've actually done the full maxi dress, so I'm going to be overlocking right from the bottom hem all the way up to the top and just up to the underarm seam up here. And we'll do that on both the back and the front of the dress. We're going to turn the dress inside out now so that the right sides of the fabric are aligned. Our lining is still loose at this point and we just overlocked this seam down here, independent of the other one. We've got two overlocked raw edges. I'm now just going to pin the centre bodice pieces together so that they align as a reference to make sure that everything is all nicely level. And pin it there, and then we do have a notch further down here. Now you may have lost that notch when you overlocked the edges, however you finished them. So if you have, just get your pattern piece out and mark that again, exactly where that is. And that is your notch to denote where the bottom of the zip should be. So pop a pin in there. I would recommend if you put a double pin, like so 2 pins in there, that'll be a really nice easy reference when you sew up the seam to remember to stop when you hit the double pin. And then just continue pinning the entire length of this seam. And make sure that to start off with, you're lining up where the gathers of the dress are on both sides of the skirt, so that you're just going to get a really nice finish there, so they're just aligned really beautifully. Again, just lining up these reference points of where the bottom tier of the gathers is, so that when we sew it, it just looks like one nice continuous seam. And now we're just going to sew from the hem all the way up to our double pins up here, which is our zip notch. We're just going to sew it with a standard seam allowance. I'm just going to turn the dress the right way out, as is shown in our instructions. There are a number of different ways that you can insert a zip. Now, when we were designing the instructions for this particular pattern, we did review a number of different ways of doing it, and this is the way that we thought we'd like to teach you with this pattern. So let's do it. Worth saying that if you know how to sew an invisible zip and you have your way and your method that you really enjoy doing it, please do feel free to deviate from the instructions and make, sew it the way that you prefer. This is just one way we thought was quite helpful and quite methodical for people who are learning how to sew and aren't that confident yet with how to sew a zip. So to start off with, on the right side of the fabric, I've got a friction pen, which is a washable pen. And it comes in loads of different colours. You can buy them from supermarkets all over the place, this ink will wash off when you put the fabric through the washing machine, so it's just like a temporary marker. You can also use chalk, or you could even hand stitch, but what I'm just asking you to do, or do a tacking stitch, is just mark your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance from the edge of the fabric. So I'm just marking a few little points all the way along here until you get to the point in the fabric down here where you've sewn the seam together. And the same on the other side. So here we have our invisible zip. You can see it here. I'm going to open it out and you can see, so that's the right side. If I turn it over to the wrong side, you can see that the zip is made of a series of coils on both sides of the zip, isn't it? And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to, if you can feel it, you can feel that it will roll out as you move it slightly like that. And what I want us to do is to iron it so that that coil of that row of coils is pushed out so that it sits a bit flatter compared to when it's rolled over like that. So we're going to do that with the iron, and we'll do it now for both sides of the zip. So I'm going to lay it down, and then I'm just gently going to push it over with my fingers. I'm going to have the iron on a low heat, not on a high heat, just a low heat. You don't want to burn the zip. And then I'm just going to run the top of the iron down quite quickly down the zip so that it just remembers to just roll out a little bit. Now you don't want to iron it too hot or keep the iron on it too much, simply because it's made of plastic and you don't want to melt the coils. So it's a bit of a fine art, this, but it's really worth doing, and it will give you the finish that you want. So we've done it on one side, and we'll just repeat that whole process for the other side. We're now going to attach this zip onto this seam. Okay, so the right side of our zip is facing up, the right side of the fabric is facing up. I'm now going to flip the zip over and place it like that. I'm trying to make sure that I'm aligning the centre of the coils here with the markers that I drew on or basted on in place, the middle of the zip there. I'm also going to make sure that I'm aligning the top of the zip, so you can see what the top of the zip is, because if you just push those coils over, if you just push the zip tape over, it sits flat. And you can also see where the zipper top is there. I want to align that with the top of the seam here, between the main fabric and the lining, so that hopefully we'll get a really nice clean finish up there. Now, you might find it easier to open up your zip as you pin this, or you might like to keep it closed. That's completely up to you. I'm going to open my zip up for the sake of this. It's just helpful to have it closed when you're laying it on, just to make sure you get it to the right side. However, if you open it up, you can really check that your coils are lining up nice and neatly with your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, which was there, wasn't it? This can be a bit fiddly, but just take your time, there's no rush. And we just want to get this zip like really beautifully inserted into our fabric. Continue just aligning that coil all the way down your seam. When you get up to the bottom of the zip here, where your notches were in your fabric and where you stopped the seam allowance, where you stopped sewing the seam and the skirt together, just make sure those coils will sit comfortably into that seam allowance there. Okay, brilliant. You've now pinned your zip in place, and we're now going to baste it in place. We're going to use a standard zipper foot to do this, which looks something like this. Different types of machines obviously have lots of different versions of it. This is the one I'm going to use now. We're going to use a long stitch length to sew the zip. At this point, this is just a basting stitch, just to hold it in place before we use our invisible zipper foot to sew the final stitches of the zip in place. We're now going to attach this invisible zipper foot into the sewing machine, and as you can see, it's got these grooves down both sides of the centre piece. Now these grooves are designed to accommodate the zipper teeth beautifully. Okay, so we've got our zip coil sitting really comfortably in that groove there. As we sew, I'm just going to really gently roll the tape of the zip across a little bit more, just how we ironed it previously, so that I can make sure that we are getting the sewing machine to stitch almost right in there, right there, so that the fabric is as close as possible to the zip coil teeth. At this point, we have sewn up one side of the zip onto the fabric, and I'm literally just going to check that it is still going to zip all the way up, which it does, which is great news. So congratulate yourself if you got that far. You can see how nicely that's going to sit. We're now going to sew the other side of the zip. to the other side, to the back of the garment. And I'm actually going to turn the garment inside out. We're going to pin this zip to this right side of the fabric, and we're going to make sure that we're aligning the centre of the zip with this marker point where we marked up the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance off the edge of the fabric at this point. But I'm also going to make sure that I'm lining up the seam of the bodice panels as well. So just take your time to line this up really nicely. And these are the key bits that we're wanting to make sure are beautifully aligned. I'm going to continue pinning that. I'm just going to lay it out nice and flat now. And we're going to baste that in place using a standard zipper foot. You may want to undo your zip before you sew this, just to make it a little bit easier to stitch. And we'll now start on the second side. And now we'll sew this side using the invisible zipper foot. Okay, so at this point we've sewn our zip in, we've sewn the zip tape into the sides of the dress, and we've used an invisible zipper foot to sew the zip in. So if we do the zip up, all the way up to the top, it should have a really nice, neat finish. Can you see that? So it should be, you shouldn't even be able to see the invisible zip. You can still see some of my markings here, but we can just iron those off, so that's not a problem at all. That should be your end result at this stage. Now then, at the bottom of the zip that you've sewn, you might notice that you have got a little bit of a gap, a little bit of a hole, which is absolutely fine, but we just want to sew that up now. The reason why we've got that hole is because we sewed the skirt up to that point, and then obviously we've only been able to sew the zip down to it, not all the way down to the seam at the bottom, so we have a little bit of a gap here. We're just going to rectify that next with the next steps of the instructions. So turn the dress inside out. We're literally just trying to join up that little gap there between the two rows of stitches so that we don't have a hole in our seam. So if you have a look at the sewing instructions, you can see we're just going to sew between those two bits. Okay, so we're going to pull the zipper tape away, and I'm just going to pin this seam allowance together so that I know exactly what I'm stitching. And I'm going to start my row of stitching where I finished sewing my seam allowance previously. I'm pulling the zipper tape away as I stitch. We now have sewn up that little hole at the bottom of our zip, and we now just want to secure the zipper tape so that it sits flat onto the seam allowance. So we'll just do that using our zipper foot, sewing the zipper tape just onto one side of the seam allowance. And repeat for the same extent on the other side of the zipper tape. At this point you've secured your zip and you've done everything you need to do with the zip, but if, like me, you've got a long bit of zip remaining and it's sort of flapping around, we don't want that. So I'm just going to show you now in detail how to just trim that off nice and neatly and secure the bottom of it. So let's get into that detail now. Okay, so we're just going to secure the tape at the bottom here now. We've got our row of stitches where we secured the tape on, and at this point I'm just going to sew using my needle through and around to the bottom, through and over the zipper tape at this point. Just going to repeat that stitch a number of times. And this is basically creating a full stop to the end of the zip, just in case the zipper pull extends all the way down to this point. This row of stitches will prevent it from falling off the zip. And then we're just simply going to cut the end of that tape off. And that is how we finish it. We're moving on to finishing off the lining and attaching it onto the dress. So the first step is simply to turn up the sides of the lining, turn up the raw edges of the lining under 1.5 centimetres all the way round with right sides together. So I've got the wrong side of my lining facing up. I'm going to start with the waist seam effectively here. I'm going to turn that up by 1.5 centimetres. If you're not sure how far 1.5 centimetres is, you may want to just measure that off to start off with. Now you can either do it that way and say that's 1.5 from the edge of the turned under seam, or you can just measure 3 centimetres from the raw edge all the way along, which is probably quicker, because then if you fold it in half, that's your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So that is the method that I'm going to use and demonstrate here for you. Wrong sides together and folding up this raw edge by 1.5 centimetres. Once you've done the bottom, we're just going to repeat the same for the side bit here. And the same for the other side over here. Just going to undo that zip to make it a bit easier for me to navigate around all of this. We're now going to pin the bottom edge of this lining to our seam down here, and also just going to tuck in the zip and fold that lining so that it sits really nice and close to the zip coil. When you reach the corner, you just want to make sure that you're tucking that raw edge under so that it's not going to show when you stitch it in place. I'm now going to pin the lining at the seam allowance here, just to make sure that I am definitely going to be lining everything up correctly. And I've got enough fabric to extend the width of this that I don't accidentally get that, make it too long or too short. As I always like to pin, I'm next going to pin in the middle. Just making sure that the lining is slightly overlapping the row stitching that you can see attaching the skirt to the bodice. There are two ways that you could sew this lining to the main fabric. You could either stitch in the ditch from the right side up, or you can hand sew it. I would recommend hand sewing it. It doesn't take that long, and it gives you a really nice, neat finish. And so that's the method that we've written in our instructions. Again, at this end, I'm just going to tuck that zip tape down and under, making sure that the lining is going to capture it really nicely. Okay, so starting at one side, up at the top by the zip. When you're sewing the lining to the main fabric, you want to make sure that you're not that the needle doesn't go all the way through to the other side, so you're literally just sort of catching a tiny bit of the main fabric or the zip. At this point I'm just doing the zip, so I'm literally just catching the zipper tape and then also catching the lining, and I'm constantly checking as well underneath, like that I've not sent the needle through accidentally, that I've not taken up too much. As I get to this corner here, I'm just making sure that I'm tucking in any of the raw edges of the lining. As you're sewing the lining to the skirt, I'm literally just grabbing hold of just the seam allowance of the skirt to the main fabric bodice. I'm just catching that and then lining it up and then catching the fold of the lining. Excellent. Once you've finished all of that hand stitching, it should look something like this. And the top of your zip should be aligning really nicely with the top of your arm seam under here. Just going to check that zip one more time just to make sure it's definitely working still, now that we've done the lining as well. And it is. Excellent. Oh, that's looking really good. We're almost there now, guys. Not long to go. It's now time to hem the skirt. So we're almost there. We've got 2 more steps to go before we finish. So we need to hem the entire skirt, which is the bottom of the skirt. Lots of different ways of doing this again, but the way that we're going to do it today is we are going to use our fabric pen and the instructions say to turn the hem up 1.5 centimetres, iron it in place, and then turn it up again another 1.5 centimetres. We're going to iron that in place. Now it's an easy hem to iron because it's, and an easy hem to do because it's just a big long rectangle, so it's not curved, it's not difficult. It should just fold under really nicely and easily. So off you go, turn it up by 1.5 centimetres or 15 mil, and again by another 15 mil. We folded the seam and ironed it, so we folded it over once and then we folded it over again just to capture that raw edge within that fold. I'm now going to turn the fabric over so it's right side facing up, and I'm going to stitch with this side facing up on my sewing machine. And I'm going to sew it at 1.3 centimetres from, or 13 mil from the folded edge, to make sure that I'm just catching all of the folded fabric so I haven't got any bits that are loose and are flapping once I've sewn the seam. We are going to use the top stitch length, so for me that's, I'm going to do that at 1.8. Okay, so we've sewn our hem. You can then iron it just to give it a really nice crisp finish. And then the final step, and this is a step that you only need to do if you think you actually need it. It's optional, but we've included it in the instructions just in case. The final step is to have a look at your zip up here and see how well and how neatly you've managed to sew it up to the top. If you feel that you're happy with that and you've actually managed to get your zip really close to the seam up here, then that's great. You're done, you're finished, you don't need to do anything else, your dress is complete. However, if you have struggled a little bit with your zip and you haven't quite managed to get that nice top finish, and maybe your zip kind of starts about there and you've got a bit of a gap here, the only way that I would recommend to resolve that so you get a nice neat finish at the top is actually to put a hook and eye, 2 separate pieces, on the inside to hold that bit together. And that's why we've put the hook and eye instructions on in the instructions for the sewing pattern. So this is optional. And for this one, I actually don't really think it needs it, but I will show you how to do it anyway. First of all, I'm going to turn the dress inside out. Lovely. Okay, so we've got our zip here, and basically what we're wanting to do is to attach the hook bit on that side and the eye bit on this side, and we're only going to sew that into the lining so that it just helps secure that top bit closed ultimately. In order to do this nice and neatly, I'm actually just going to unzip the dress so I've got more space to play around with, and we'll start on this side. Now I've got a black one here so you can see the contrast, which I hope is helpful. We're going to attach our hook onto the very top of the zip here in such a way that the edge of the hook just extends in parallel with the edge of the coils of the zip. Now when we sew this, we're just sewing it through the lining only. We don't want the stitches to come through onto the other side here. Perfect. Once you've sewn that in place, finish off those ends and we'll move on to the opposite side. And we're just going to make sure that this bit also lines up with the top of the zip. You see those two are lining up really nicely. And remember, if you're getting worried, if this is beginning to look messy or you're unhappy with the standard of quality, No one is going to see this except for you. So let's not get stressed about it. Let's just enjoy the journey. Perfect. So now if we do up the zip and we do up the hook and the eye, we have a really nice, neat closure. And that's all it's doing really. It's just holding it in place, reinforcing it and making sure that it looks that it's going to hold and be steady. Again, the reason why I would suggested this is because if you haven't managed to sew your zip right up to the top, this is just going to hold it in place too. So just reinforce that. You could even sew a bit closer if you wanted to. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a while to kind of locate these in exactly the right locations, but there you have it. So well done, everybody. We have finished our dress. So I hope that you really enjoyed that. You've had a really fun experience. Thank you for joining me. And please don't forget to tag us on social media using the hashtag, which will be below in the text underneath this video. And yeah, thank you very much for joining me. Let me know your thoughts.